Welcome. My name is Genesis Brown, and I'm doing a presentation on amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or Lou Gehrig's disease. So, without further ado, let's get right into it. Lou Gehrig, the Iron Horse. Now, it's only right to mention him when you bring up Lou Gehrig's disease or ALS, simply because he is the reason why in the United States we have such widespread advocacy of the disease. ALS was identified in 1869 by French neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot. But it was only until about 1939 when Lou Gehrig was diagnosed with the disease at age 36 years old that it prompted everyone to start trying to figure out what's going on. He played for the Yankees, and when he was diagnosed with ALS, the ribbon for ALS was actually blue and white striped to signify his career as a baseball player. Now it's red. Um, and I think that that is a really cool ribbon to have, and we'll get more into it later on down the line. Asking, what exactly is ALS? ALS is the most common motor neuron disease in adults and is characterized by the neurodegeneration of motor neurons in the brain and spinal cord. So, what that means is basically the neurons in the brain and spinal cord start to lose function and then they eventually die. About 5,000 people in the US are diagnosed with ALS each year, according to ALS News Today. 20% of patients live 5 or more years post diagnosis. About 10% of patients live 10 or more years past diagnosis. 5 live 20 years or more. But the typical diagnosis of or cases of ALS are sporadic, which means they don't really have a direct cause, though they are making up the majority of all cases. Only about 5 to 10%, according to the National Library of Medicine, are actually of pathophysiological hereditary descent. Mentioned earlier, some genetic factors that may cause ALS are familial ALS, FALS, which makes up the majority of, the minority of cases. Sporadic ALS makes up the majority of all cases, which means most cases have no known history of the disease or genetic susceptibility. However, there are certain factors like environmental factors that have been looked into recently as towards where this disease may come from. So, exposure to toxins, pollutants, metals, pesticides, and industrial chemicals have been suggested. However, there are no specific mechanisms underlying their contribution to the pathogenesis. Physical trauma or traumatic injuries have been proposed as triggers, as well as viral infections. Some pathophysiological mechanisms of ALS include the dysregulations of glutamine signaling and exotoxicity have been implicated in ALS. Oxidative stress, or the imbalance between oxidative stress and antioxidant defenses, can contribute to motor neuron degeneration, resulting in cellular damage and dysfunction. Another thing, the third thing, that can possibly contribute to the development of ALS is protein misfolding. So, abnormal aggregation of proteins such as TDP43, FUS, and SOD1 disrupt cellular homeostasis, and it can contribute to the neurodegeneration that is found in ALS. Moving right along. What's the pathophysiology behind ALS? What are some mechanisms involved in the ALS progression and the neurodegenerative processes? Excitotoxicity is one. So, glutamate mediated excitotoxicity plays a significant role in ALS. Excessive glutamate leads to overstimulation of glutamate receptors, resulting in influx of calcium and neuronal death. The second thing would be oxidative stress. So, if there's a dysregulation of oxidative stress pathways, including mitochondrial dysfunction and impaired antioxidant defenses, motor neurons degenerate. The increased production of oxygen species, or ROS, results in damages of cellular components, leading to more death and more injury of the neurons. Third thing would be misfolding protein aggregation. That is number one thing that we see in ALS pathology. Mutations in genes such as SOD1, TDP43, and FUS lead to the misfolding of proteins, forming toxic aggregates that disrupt cellular function and contribute to neurodegeneration. Mitochondrial dysfunction also contributes because impaired mitochondrial function, including deficits in energy and metabolism, calcium, and homeostasis, contributes to motor neuron degeneration. That is one thing that we're going to keep hearing here, is that when there is excessive calcium, the motor neurons are dying. The calcification of motor neurons is death of the motor neurons. And death of the motor neurons means processes and communications cannot be passed throughout the body. Mitochondrial dysfunction exacerbates oxidative stress and compromises neuronal viability. So, inflammation or chronic neuron inflammation is characterized by activation of microglia and astrocytes. It contributes to ALS progression. So, as the disease grows onward, we will see more and more inflammation of the neurons. Axonal transport deficits will also occur, which means that the mechanisms will be impaired. There will be delivery of essential cellular components like proteins and organelles to distal regions of the motor neurons. They will be slowed or absolutely non compliant. There will be little to no axonal transport in patients with ALS. Another thing, the final thing that contributes to ALS pathophysiology is RNA dysmetabulation. So when there's a dysregulation, I'm going to say it. When there's a dysregulation of RNA metabolism, like alterations in RNA processing, splicing, and transport, this is what we see in the pathogenesis of ALS. Abnormalities in binding proteins found in NRA, like TDP43 and FUS, the main two, disrupt RNA hemostasis, which leads to dysfunction and degeneration of motor neurons. This is all to say that the main pathophysiology behind ALS is the death and degeneration of motor neurons. If there is no neurogenesis, if there is no progression, growth of the motor neuron, if there is no transport of the motor neuron, you will lose functionality. And the top thing to remember here is that every organ in our body has some kind of muscle contraction, from our heart to our stomach to our lungs, our arms, not just the things that we control, but also involuntary muscle movements are affected by ALS. And we will learn later in the PowerPoint how that presents itself throughout the pathology of this disease. Their elaboration of clinical presentation would be what to look out for when we have patients coming in. What signs and symptoms should we look to see and be like, this sounds similar to what ALS is. Now, it is important to note, especially during my research of ALS, one, as a nurse, we can't diagnose anything. Two, doctors, it takes about 2 to 3 doctors, specialists that can see, diagnose, and actually understand what is going on in the motor neurons to be able to say, yes, this patient has ALS. That is not a disease that anyone, health practitioner wise, wants to just place on someone. The signs and symptoms that patients see are muscle weakness, muscle atrophy, some spasticity, which means like the muscles are going to be weak. We're not going to be able to move like we usually do. There's going to be a lot of spasms. There'll be bulbar symptoms, like they won't be able to, they'll be feeling more like dislocation feelings in their muscles. They will have eventually compromised respiratory, like I was mentioning. Muscle contractions, muscle movements cannot happen if there is a death of the motor neuron, which will also present itself as muscle fatigue and fasciculations. Now, some differential diagnoses are primary lateral sclerosis, spinal muscular atrophy, myasthenia gravis, and Lyme disease. These all present with different symptoms that ALS may have in common, like the weakness or the muscle atrophy, some respiration compromise. There are many, many diagnoses that can have clinical presentations that are similar to ALS but are not quite as life-threatening as ALS. Less disease progression. So we start off in the early stages with a little bit of weakness, some twitching, cramping in one region or more of the body. This is usually around the time when patients are attributing their signs and symptoms to just aging. There's a lot of things that come with getting older, like that we may not notice until we get to that age. And that's something that I've noticed about um, these conversations that I have witnessed about ALS. A lot of the first signs and symptoms go unnoticed simply because they're regular signs and symptoms. And like I previously mentioned, a lot of our patients get diagnosed with ALS in midlife around the 50s. Lou Gehrig got diagnosed at 39. Typically, 40 to 50 is the age range. It can happen earlier. Stephen Hawking's, which we'll get into a little bit later down the line, he was actually diagnosed at the ripe age of 26, and he lived 50 more years after that. Um, However, most people don't really start to acknowledge that something is wrong until we get into this middle stage here, where they have difficulty with mobility and speech and swallowing because certain muscle groups are really starting to feel the effect of the degeneration behind the motor neurons. Um, Mobility, such as you're not able to get places as much, or you're not able to stand as quick as you used to, or you feel like a weak gait when you do stand or you start to walk, and difficulty swallowing. So the late stage, this is usually once people have already gotten the diagnosis, have gone through the processes of understanding what it is that they are actually feeling. This is usually presented with paralysis. Eventually down the line, they have to do mechanical ventilation due to the lungs not being able to capture enough oxygen as quickly or as often enough for the muscles to actually receive oxygen, all the other muscles that are actually still working. Um, we also will see functional impairment, of course, because there is muscular dystrophy. The rate of progression varies widely among individuals, and it's mainly influenced by factors such as the age of onset, the symptom and the site of the onset, genetic factors, and overall health. On average, ALS progresses rapidly. Most patients experience significant functional decline within the first 2 to 5 years of symptom onset. Some individuals may have a slower or rapid progressive course. I noticed that in the beginning of ALS research, there wasn't much of a life expectancy. You had about 3 to 4 years, and this is pre- it's presented in the evidence here. You have about 2 to 5 years worth of significant functional decline in onset. Now imagine if it were pre-research studies that we have now, even less time than that. The prognosis of ALS is progressive and ultimately fatal disease. Um, Survival outcomes do vary. Some patients live much, much longer, like we spoke of. Um, some people have a rapid rate of progression due to different comorbidities. Like I said, patients are diagnosed midlife. There is a lot of things at this point, from cholesterol to osteoporosis to rheumatoid arthritis, all kinds of bone and muscular electrolyte imbalance, all kinds of things that could be happening in the human body that could contribute to the rapid morbidity of motor neurons. Some ALS treatments include medications like riluzone or edarvone. Hope I'm saying that right. There is no cure for ALS, but there are several medications that can help slow the disease progression and maintain some symptoms. So, riluzole works by reducing glutamine levels in the brain, which we spoke about earlier, and it potentially slows down the progression of the disease. And edaverone is believed to reduce the oxidative stress, which may preserve the motor function in ALS patients. Now, these two are the top two drugs for the top two symptoms of ALS. Um, some other things that may be supportive in the treatment of ALS include different therapies like physical therapy, speech therapy, occupational therapy, social workers, respiratory therapy, dietitians, psychologists, and for all the obvious reasons, okay? Our patients are going to need physical therapy due to the degeneration of the muscles and the muscle tissue. They're going to need speech therapy because eventually they won't be able to talk. um, they're going to need occupational therapy. They're going to need social workers. They're really going to need our social workers here. This disease is rapid and it can change your life in a matter of 2 to 5 years, as we're learning here, where they're going to need respiratory therapy because the lungs are going to start feeling weird and not working to their optimal capabilities. We're going to need the dietitians because if swallowing is difficult, eating is going to be difficult. And all of this, again, just to loop it all in, they're going to need a really big support system, not just from families, but from healthcare as well. We are going to have to be with these patients and give them the type of teaching and education for them to be able to continue life with a good quality of it. They're going to need us in every sense, form, and fashion. So now some assistive devices and technology. Some devices to aid with communication. Can, Communication devices include augmentative and alternative communication devices, or AAC. They help communicate when speech is impaired. Picture boards, or SGDs, have text to speech capabilities, and we will get into those because I think those are so cool. ALS has some of the most advanced technological systems because of how advanced the disease will basically destroy the muscle we have. Every muscle, every body mechanic is controlled by a muscle. And because of this, they need these things like eye tracking systems that will allow them to communicate or control devices using eye movements. So, Stephen Hawking's, we spoke about him earlier. He is a perfect example of how assistive technologies can help people with disorders that can impair their ability to communicate traditionally. His wheelchair, for example, is equipped with simple to use software that can be controlled by eye and cheek movement. Those are the eye tracking systems and SGDs that we were talking about. Stephen lived over 50 years after his diagnosis. And this is an extremely rare condition. And 50 years ago, we did not have the technologies to even maintain life this long. So he is a medical miracle in my eyes. Every year, a new iPhone comes out. But for people with ALS and other neurodegenerative diseases, the software required to live or access resources that can make their life easier are very expensive and very hard to come by, which is why we need to advocate for our disabled community. Their mobile aids like wheelchairs and the mobility scooters, those help too. Um, we are trying to advance technology. I have heard of brain computer interfaces, and that's what this picture is illustrating here: the tablet, the implanted electrode strips, the amplifier and transmitter that's implanted, antenna, the receiver, like really getting into the nitty gritty of bypassing impaired motor function. And I think it is so cool to see how science can incorporate robotic assistive devices to help people with different impairments. Some other things that they're working on is functional electrical stimulation, where electrical stimulation can be given to muscles to restore the functional movements in patients with weakness or paralysis. These FES can assist with activities such as standing, walking, and hand function. Whew. These patients are in dire need of assistive technology and assistive devices. We need to help as fast as we can and to find cures, and if not cures, just way to give back, the way to give these patients a quality of life that it will in such a short amount of time be stripped away from them. Now, nutritional support and respiratory care is very important in patients with ALS. So it's important to support their overall health, to preserve their muscle strength, and optimize their quality of life, which I'm direly expressing throughout this presentation. Malnutrition and weight loss are common due to the swallowing difficulties, muscle weakness, and the increased energy expenditure. Day-to-day life is increasingly difficult, making it just an all around exhausting process. And we all know how hard it is to get up and get anything to eat when you are that tired. So, some nutritional interventions are NG tube placements or percutaneous endographic and percutaneous endoscopic gastrotomy. They may be necessary for ALS patients with severe dysphagia or compromised oral intakes. Um, the medication can also be given through these NG tubes. Now, the one thing that I know as a healthcare professional who has worked closely with patients with NG tubes, it is not enjoyable for them. I wish there was an easier way to have food delivered. NG tubes are absolutely uncomfortable. Another thing is respiratory management. Nutritional support and respiratory care is top two most important things for patients with ALS. Okay, it's the leading cause of morbidity and mortality. So, a few things that they can do to maintain adequate oxygenation and ventilation is to use a vent, and a ventilator, a BiPAP machine, a CPAP machine, any devices associated with respiratory failure and providing ventilator support. Um, these things are very, very, very important for the overall health of our patient when it comes to ALS. Every muscle is affected by this. So, some things that may come up during diagnosis is psychological and social impact. ALS is not only affecting physical health, but it also has a profound psychological and social implication for patients. Patients experience emotional challenges like loss and grief, anxiety, depression, loss of identity, and role changes. ALS can disrupt patients' sense of identity and self worth, and engaging in meaningful activities and hobbies that they once found enjoyable. And not only for our patients, but also their family. Family members can feel stress and burnout, financial hardship, loss of identity and role changes, and communication difficulties due to the suddenness and severity of an ALS diagnosis. So, some research initiatives that are currently underway are genetic studies, RNA therapeutics, neuroprotection and neuroinflammation studies, stem cell therapy, gene therapy. Current research initiatives in ALS are focused on understanding the underlying mechanisms of disease progression, identifying novel therapeutic targets, and developing innovative treatment approaches. Some notable areas of research and emerging treatments are as for teen. The Ice Bucket Challenge took the world by storm. I know there is somebody out there watching this that was just waiting for me to bring up the Ice Bucket Challenge. Um, it was some of our first introductory into awareness of ASL in education. The challenge consisted of one or multiple people dumping a bucket of ice water over them, naming friends to participate and challenge the next while donating to the ALS Foundation if they could. While I was only in middle school, the challenge was my introduction into a realm of healthcare that would have otherwise gone without notice. I would like to highlight the importance of these types of diseases and acknowledging the opportunity of situational blindness for able bodied individuals. The basis of my exploration, the basis of this entire presentation, all started with the Ice Bucket Challenge on Instagram 10 years ago. How do you become an ally? Becoming an ally is crucial because it sheds light on this debilitating neurodegenerative disease. It promotes understanding, it encourages support, it really shows the world that there is a reality outside of what they see every day. The importance of advocacy is to provide resources, research, and support. Say it with me. Resources, research, and support. One more time. Resources, research, and support. It is dire that ALS foundations get the money that they need, the grants that they need to be able to help other people. There are many people on any given day in the United States diagnosed with ALS who need our support. And some of them include the ALS Foundation for Life, Live Like Lou Foundation, the Les Turner Foundation, and the ALS Association. Arrived to my favorite slide of the slideshow, the ALS Hall of Fame, where we shout out all the people who have lived through ALS. ALS has claimed the lives of many individual influencers. The men pictured smiling, only one remains earthside. O.J. Brigance was a star NFL and Canadian Football League linebacker. After being diagnosed with ALS in 2007, O.J., a former NFL champion turned Baltimore Ravens executive, alongside his wife Shonda, established the Brigance Brigade, a foundation with the aim of supporting, motivating, and uplifting individuals affected by ALS. After 17 years, the foundation has made significant strides, providing direct aid to numerous families and fostering a close-knit network spanning across the Mid-Atlantic region and beyond. The Brigance Brigade website highlights each family they have helped directly. This wouldn't be a Hall of Fame section without including their names as well. Though there are many names listed, there are still thousands of unsung survivors and their families fighting for a cure each day. Through our Hall of Fame, we see Henry A. Wallace, the 33rd U.S. Vice President, Stephen Hawking, the theoretical physicist, Stephen Hillenburg, the creator of SpongeBob SquarePants, John Stone, the creator of Sesame Street, Izzard Charles, a boxing champion, and of course, our star, O.J. Brigance. All the names here in blue, from Lola to Lisa, Abby to Lance, Monique, Jerry and Linda, all of these people have fought the silent fight with ALS and have found support through the Brigance Brigade Foundation, where you can find more information and also provide donations if you can. Really drive this point home, shall we? ALS is a progressive neurodegenerative disease and is characterized by the degeneration of motor neurons in the brain and spinal cord. Some symptoms include muscle weakness, paralysis, respiratory insufficiency, and vary in severity from stages 1 through 3, first to last. And management involves multidisciplinary approaches like medications, therapies, assistance devices, nutritional support, and respiratory care. ALS significantly impacts patients, caregivers, and families emotionally, socially, and financially. Continued research and support are essential to improving understanding, treatment, and ultimately to find a cure for ALS. Call to action for continued support and research would be to increase funding for ALS. Okay, we need to support advocacy efforts and raise awareness to promote access to care and improve the quality of life for ALS patients and their families. We need to encourage collaborations among researchers, clinicians, advocacy organizations, and policymakers so we can address the complex challenges of ALS. We need to advocate for policies that enhance access to healthcare, support services, and assistive technologies for ALS patients and caregivers. We need to participate in fundraising as we can and really, really, really help to find a cure. I would love to acknowledge the courageous and resilient ALS patients and their families who constantly succeed in the face of adversity, and the dedication and passion of our healthcare professionals, researchers, advocacy organizations, and the generosity of donors and others who have helped make this presentation possible. And without further ado, here are my sources or two. May you have a wonderful, wonderful day, and I hope you learned something.